Welcome back to Between the Rounds. I'm your host, Sarah C. Now today I'm breaking down what has been an absolute action-packed weekend of boxing. It finished out last night with Teofimo Lopez as the new WBA Welterweight Champion of the World. He won by majority decision over Rolly Romero in Las Vegas and now becomes a third division world champion. And Friday night, who would have thought we saw boxing make its move to TikTok? And on Saturday, DAZN brought us a full day of action from London to Las Vegas. And then I also got to see some fun on Santa Monica Pier, supporting two fighters that I really appreciate in the sport. For MVP specifically, Amanda Serrano kept her titles, but it was by no means an easy victory. Right hook Roxy and Miguelina Hernandez went 8 rounds, which people are still actually arguing about today. Mortensen got dropped and still left with the world title. And then Tia Ayton, back in the UK, didn't wait for the judges. She stopped Ellie Helaway in the 6th and walked out with the Commonwealth Featherweight Title in her 7th pro fight. And then on the pier in Santa Monica, both Tommy Hyde and Andy Dominguez finished inside the distance. That's the weekend, so let's get into it. So we had Amanda Serrano versus Lucrezia Manzor. And this fight was supposed to be the first women's world title fight ever streamed live on TikTok. But in actual fact, the fight between Mortensen and Mayelli Flores beat them to it because that was on the undercard for the vacant WBA super bantamweight title. Now, across the night, there were over 3 million views on TikTok. I have to personally say I went back and watched most of the fight card on YouTube because some of the live commentary wasn't very good. I was quite grateful that they had Christina Poncher on YouTube because outside of her, the TikTok side left a lot to be desired. And it was probably a pretty rough night for Dan Canobio because he's seen as a credible voice in this sport too. So we know Serrano holds titles in 7 weight divisions, more than any woman in history in this sport. And she was also chasing that all-time knockout record and also fighting 12 2-minute rounds. And then Manzor is the WBO number 2 out of Argentina. And this is her first world title opportunity after a 5-fight win streak. Now, Manzor certainly came to fight. She took the first half of this fight cleanly. She was coming in with a really effective but a very unusual type of jab. It was like this chopping hook and then was following up with some big overhands. She was being pretty effective too with switching to southpaw stances mid-round. And she also had an interesting style with dipping her head while throwing her shots. She was really forcing Serrano to box on the outside. You just couldn't tell where the next shot was coming from. And that unpredictability alone kept Serrano guessing and off balance. You could tell Serrano was struggling to find her timing and her rhythm, and she was taking big shots on the back foot. She was trying to circle to her right to avoid that overhand as well. Now, don't get me wrong, Serrano was giving some of her signature bodywork back, but she just looked uncomfortable and unsteady in stretches of the fight. Now, through the first 5 rounds, it was clearly Manzor's fight. And round 6 was the first real shift that we started to see. Serrano started to increase her output, putting lovely combinations together, going from the body back to the head, instead of letting Manzor dictate the action. By the 8th, she was the cleaner combination puncher, landing sharper 2 and 3 punch sequences, and then the occasional hard body shot, which you could tell were starting to hurt Manzor. Now, Manzor began to get sloppy and even more predictable with the single shot counters as the fight advanced. Now, up to round 8, I had it 5-3 to Manzor, but then Serrano came back and closed the gap with the better work, the better combinations, and the cleaner ring generalship. And so the fight resulted with Serrano winning by majority decision. She gets to keep her featherweight titles, her 50th win as a pro. Now, while she didn't get the knockout, she stays tied with the great Christy Martin at 32 KOs. And credit to Manzor, who forced Serrano to fight for every single round. And look, we know Serrano's coming to the end of her career. This woman has had 55 battles. And she said herself, these young women are tough and fast and they're coming to take her head off. And believe me, while I'm on a different level, I know that feeling where you're just thinking my pace, my timing, all of that is just starting to dwindle. So respect to Serrano for staying in the fight. You cannot discredit her for what she's doing for this sport. I want to touch on Jahmal Harvey because obviously I'm a huge fan of these dual gender fight cards. And this is a major signing for MVP Promotion who signed him just last year. Now, Jahmal Harvey is 23-year-old and a 2024 US Olympian. And he has now made it 4 straight wins as a pro. And this one was a brutal second round stoppage of Hamak Keb. Now, Harvey came into the pro ranks with 61-8 amateur record, 2021 world champion, and also holds a gold from the Pan American Games. He's a 10-time US national champion, and that pedigree shows. Now, he was on Keb from the opening bell, from the bodywork, the uppercuts, the constant pressure. And at just 2 minutes, 48 seconds of the second, he landed a clean right hand and followed up with a hook that put Keb away. There was no survival mode, no drama. Just a young prospect who already looks ready for bigger stages. So that's a great signing for MVP as Harvey now advances to 4-0. Then we've Brook, Sibrian versus Lupita Medina. Now this one was always going to be personal. Medina turned pro at 22 with 5 junior Olympic titles and is ranked number 2 on the WBO and IBF rankings at the 105-pound division. She can fight effectively from both stances, switching mid-round, a tool that not many fighters at her weight have accomplished. Now, interestingly, Sibrian found boxing at 26 in a fitness class after having a career at the Wall Street Journal. Now, she trained alongside Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez earlier on, and that really shaped her into this pressure fighter that has real output. She had won 2 USA Boxing national titles and represented El Salvador at the 2023 Central American Games. Now, this is where it gets interesting because she was a former sparring partner of Medina. So they've both shared rounds with each other. They know each other's style. But Medina went on record publicly calling Sibrian one-dimensional. And on Friday night, unfortunately, that one-dimensional style beat her. Sibrian walked forward for 8 rounds and never stopped. She took the counters and kept coming. She had beautiful body shots, uppercuts on the inside, and a pace that just didn't drop. Now, Medina showcased some lovely counter-punching in the opening rounds. She was effectively switching stances, and you could tell this is where she was comfortable. But from round 3, this is where things shifted. Once Sibrian dragged her into a sustained dogfight in the second half of round 3, Medina couldn't control the onslaught anymore. She was backing up in straight lines, and she was even checking the clock between rounds, which at that point, a fighter is really feeling the pressure. Sibrian, being the pressure fighter, dictated the last 3 rounds. And so while Medina came in as the higher ranked boxer, it didn't matter because the output and the heart of Sibrian did. And she came away with a very accomplished win. Okay, next up we have Roxy Verduzco, also known as Right Hook Roxy, and Miguelina Hernandez. Now this fight could have gone either way. People were calling it a robbery online. And it was a fight I effectively had to go back and rewatch. I had to turn off the commentary. And it's so interesting how much you can be influenced by what the commentators are saying. But when you just go back to watching the pure skill of boxing, you can see things very differently. Now, Right Hook Roxy fights out of LA. And while she just advanced to 8-0 on the professional side, her amateur career also deserves a mention because she's had 107 fights with only 6 losses and 21 national titles. She remains undefeated as a pro, and Friday night she made her MVP debut. Now, Hernandez, on the other hand, entered unbeaten with 3 of her 4 wins inside the distance. These were 2 undefeated fighters, and you can tell they're both still learning the pro game in real time. Hernandez has sparred the likes of Ashley Ann Lozado, who just fought last weekend, and she came in switching stances and she had real pop in her shots, but Roxy brought the amateur pedigree, composure, and that backhand carries genuine power. The earlier rounds were certainly a chess match for range finding. Hernandez was switching to orthodox and landing clean backhands initially. Both were largely landing same-time counters with single shots. Then Roxy started to find her range better, but needed to be busier. She was stepping out of range, but without actually countering quick enough. Hernandez struggled at times to get her 1-2 landing cleanly and wasn't always turning over her punches. There was a clash of heads earlier on as well, but that didn't slow either woman down. When they both leveled up on the output, I will say Hernandez put more pop behind the 3-4 punch combinations while back in orthodox. But Roxy answered with lovely feints and began finding a home for that backhand. And then in the 5th round, Hernandez switched back to southpaw and landed a huge jab that busted Roxy's nose. Now, Roxy appeared to be tugging at her top. She was looking for a pause from the ref, but that never came. And Hernandez took full advantage of that moment. She was clipping her with a backhand and a big left, while Roxy's lead hand was set low. Now, the later rounds stayed competitive, but they started to get messy. Roxy was showing much more of the cleaner work with 2-on-2s and some beautiful overhands. She rattled Hernandez at some points. Now, Roxy seems to have this habit of staying in the pocket with no head movement after she lands those combinations, and that ultimately costs her. It was a closely contested fight, and there was quite a few swing rounds that could have gone either way. So I've got no objection to Roxy's cleaner work and power moments, edging it on the cards to a split decision. But Hernandez absolutely proved that she belonged at this level. And that's one that I think is deserving of a rematch. Okay, so to quickly touch on, we had Melissa Mortensen versus Mayelli Flores, who's a super exciting fighter who was recently signed by MVP Promotion after going up against Ellie Helaway. Now, they fought for the vacated WBA Super Bantamweight title. Again, another fight that sparked a lot of conversation online, and a lot of people felt that Mayelli had done enough to take home that win and felt that she was robbed of the decision. Now, Mayelli Flores did score a knockdown in the second with a big body shot, but Mortensen was able to adjust from that moment and start to find her range and counter cleanly. I will say she continued to land the same combination every single time, the backhand lead hook. And they're the things that a judge can score against you when you're getting caught with the exact same clean shot. every single time. Mortensen was controlling the distance, but she did sit in the pocket for too long in moments too and exchanged with the pressure fighter. It did result in a split decision on the judges' scorecard, and Mortensen takes home the belt and moves to 10-0. Now, this was a fight I had to rewatch with no sound. And because of that knockdown, I scored it at best a draw to Mortensen, or I agreed with one of the judges and scored it 95-94 to Mayelli Flores. Next up, we have Avias Griffin versus Jackson Marinez. Now, Avias Griffin is a pressure fighter who doesn't just walk forward, he walks through people. He's got high output, he's heavy-handed, and he's built for attrition. Now, Marinez brought the more polished experience. He shared the ring with Romero, with Richard Comey, and has a recent knockout streak of his own. But he was always going to have to keep Griffin honest at range or get dragged into deep water. Now, the earlier rounds were measured. Marinez tried to box and use his experienced edge, but Griffin stayed patient, closed the distance gradually, and started to impose his physicality. By the middle rounds, the pressure was constant. Griffin walking him down, forcing exchanges, making Marinez work every second. And then Griffin turned up the volume and the power in the fifth. He dropped Marinez twice in that round. The second knockdown left the Dominican fighter clearly compromised. His corner had seen enough and retired him before the sixth round could even start. So for Griffin, that's another stoppage, another statement. He advances to 20-1 with 19 knockouts. So let's see what he does next in that welterweight division. Okay, and then there was Jully Poca, who took her first professional loss to Cinderella Linier. Now, Poca is considered the most followed active female boxer in the world with something like 3.1 million followers. Now, it's still very early stages for Jully Poca. This was only her second professional fight. Now, she has done a number of crossover fights kind of in the influencer boxing world. And then Cinderella Linier, who fights out of Arlington, Texas, also entered 1-0. So we had two fighters, both in very early stages of their career, unproven at this level. But for me, like I mentioned on social media after that night, it should have been a draw. Now, Poca started composed. She was really busy with that jab in the earlier rounds. She had really good footwork, and she was drawing Linier in and countering with real power. She was setting traps really nicely too. But then as the fight went on, she started to abandon the jab. She left her chin up on exits and got caught with the same left hook twice, and they were powerful shots that knocked her head back. But honestly, looking back at the tape, there weren't 3 clean rounds to hand a clear decision to Cinderella. It was a close fight, but it was a debatable decision. And unfortunately, Jully took her first loss on record. Okay, now over to Tia Ayton versus Ellie Helaway over the UK. Now, she just turned 20 this week and already fighting for her first title, the Commonwealth Featherweight belt. She's got the backing of Katie Taylor, and you could absolutely see why. Now, within the fight itself, I always tap into what the corner feedback is between the rounds, and the coaching from Dean Lewis in Ayton's corner was absolutely sensational. They really capitalized on her amateur fundamentals, which I love to hear. They reminded her after round 1 to make sure she was disguising her attacks, to keep edging forward, touching with that lead hand, and then initiate. They were just reminding her through the rounds to make sure she wasn't telegraphing her sequence, because she does have a tendency to kind of just walk forward with so much confidence to seek and destroy, that it's good to develop those habits earlier on in her career so that when she does start to advance, she's taking those fight tactics with her. And she executed what her corner asked of her so well. You could see when she was disguising her attacks, she was popping that lead hand really nicely to set up the backhand. And it was super clean work from the opening minute. Now, I will say in the earlier rounds, Helaway was finding a couple of moments, but not enough of them. She was fighting far too defensively and not enough output to make Ayton think twice. There was one moment in the fight that I absolutely loved. So Ayton landed a heavy backhand late in the round and then closed with a flurry of shots. She was actually blinding Helaway with the lead hand before going to work, down to the body, back up to the head. And then by round 6, both the ref and Helaway's corner had seen enough and the fight was called off. And I think just one note for Tia Ayton as she climbs through the ranks, and something that Tony Bellews also mentioned in his commentary, is that she's willing to take a shot or two to land hers. And I think that's something she just needs to be careful of against a craftier opponent who has real power. It's something that she'll just have to manage effectively as she advances against competitors. Now, in her post-fight interview, she was lovely and confident, and she was basically saying she's ready for any of them. But rightly so, I think the team are going to pace her nicely. Eddie Hearn mentioned even though she's had 6 knockouts in 7 fights, they'll tee her up for British title next, and then be on target for a world title contender towards the second half of 2027, which is absolutely the right sequencing for Tia. Okay, before we get to the big fight night in Vegas, I did want to touch on the butterfly brawl on the Santa Monica Pier, which was for Team Cancer America, because two prospects who I follow actually fought on that same card. First up, I wanted to give a shout out to Tommy Hyde, who stopped Vaughan Williams in the fourth. Now, Hyde very effectively dropped him 3 times, twice in the second and once in the third, and the referee saw enough. Hyde moves to 16-0 with 11 knockouts. It was clean, composed and classy work from the Irishman. I do recommend that you head over and give Tommy Hyde a follow on Instagram. He also covers some great post-fight analysis and someone's perspective that I really respect in this sport too. And then we've Andy Dominguez, who also got a knockout in the second round. Now, Andy had a tough opening round against Nider Valdez. Commentary, including Sean Porter, actually scored that round to his opponent. But thankfully, he came out in the second round and dropped him 3 times and it was all over. Now, even Sean Porter called out the beautiful boxing that he saw from Andy. The shot selection, the exchange, the uppercuts, the hook to the body. It was a clean liver shot that Valdez didn't recover from, and it resulted in a second round knockout for Andy Dominguez. And he advances to 14-1 with 7 knockouts. And that's now 4 straight wins for our Mexican warrior, Andy Dominguez. Okay, and so finally, a recap on the fight that we were all waiting for. Rolly Romero versus Teofimo Lopez. Now, it resulted in a majority decision. On one of the judges' scorecards, it was 114-114. Another judge's scorecard, it was 115-113. And then on the third judge's scorecard, it was 116-112. So Teofimo Lopez is the new WBA Welterweight Champion of the world and a 3-division title holder. Now, the fight itself was a chess match early on, which is what they promised us. Lopez stayed on the front foot, was working off the jab and landing smooth combinations. Rolly was looking for that one big shot, the check left hook, and he started to land it in spots and eventually busted Lopez up around the eye. But unfortunately, he never matched the output and never capitalized on those moments of opportunity. Round 5 was the only big moment for Rolly, when he finally timed a check hook and followed it with a heavy backhand that put Lopez on unsteady legs and opened up that big cut. Lopez briefly went down, right? He wobbled on his feet. I'm full sure his knee touched the canvas at that point, but it was ruled a slip. And for a moment, the fight felt like it could tilt. But instead of pressing the advantage, Rolly drifted back into the same cagey, low-output approach. Even Ismail Salas kept pleading from the corner, "Are you listening to me? The only way you win this if you let your hands go." But Rolly never fully committed to going through the gears. Having Milton LaCroix in Lopez's corner gave him a steady technical voice. And it's the kind of solid cornerman everyone knows Teo benefits from when the other voice gets loud. We all know Teo's dad can be disruptive. He even said during the fight that Teo needed that big shot in round 5 to wake him up. But credit where it's due though. The old man was effective on the night, repeatedly telling his son to keep that right hand tight as Rolly kept hunting for that lead check hook. From the 6th onwards, Lopez controlled the fight. He mixed levels, stayed disciplined, and closed the show with a sharp Superman hook in the 11th, while remaining composed in the 12th. The scorecards were closer than the actual action. It was 116-112, 115-113, and 114-114. But Lopez was the clearer, busier and smarter fighter over the distance and resulted in him becoming a 3-division world champion. Now let's just touch on Rolly's performance and mindset for a second. A few weeks ago at the press conference, from my perspective, it already looked like Rolly had given Teo the belt. And not necessarily in his words, just in his energy. He was showing him way too much respect. But maybe there was something deeper in that he wasn't believing in himself. Because last night, when even Salas couldn't get him to open up the way a champion needed to, when the big shots are landing and hurting the other man, they're the moments that you have to capitalize on. Now, for context, Rolly came to boxing late. He didn't glove up till he was 16, and after a brief amateur career, he turned pro at 21. Now, that's a much shorter runway than most world-level fighters get to before they're standing across from someone like Teofimo Lopez. There's a belief system that has to be built when you come in that late, and I'm not sure Rolly fully believes he belongs at the very top for the long haul. And sure, beating Ryan Garcia got him there, but staying at the top requires a different level of internal conversation. He didn't have to be fully present for the possibility of losing the belt the hard way, because he never fully stepped on the gas when the moments were there. And Lopez clearly didn't need to be spectacular. He just needed to be consistent and aggressive enough, and the judges gave him the majority decision. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened, but I am asking, did Rolly show up last night believing he could win, or was some part of him already bracing for the loss? Now, I'd love to hear what you all saw. So there we have it. MVP fight card was action-packed with great matchmaking. We had rising talent from the UK with a clean stoppage from Tia Ayton, and we had 2 more on Santa Monica Pier. And in Vegas, The biggest fight of the weekend went to the scorecards. And look, some fighters ooze confidence and it shows in their performance, while others still have to convince themselves they deserve the moment. Now, next weekend, we have the most anticipated women's boxing showdown between Michaela Mayer and Chantel Cameron from Birmingham, England. And I am telling you, you don't want to miss that fight because it is going to be a fight contender of the year. So that's it from me. I've been your host, Sarah Cunningham. I appreciate you all tuning in, and we'll be back breaking down more fights real soon. Keep putting in that work between the rounds.